political bang. You got your Brexit aftermath. You got your pair of blockbustery Supreme Court decisions, which we'll talk about. But you also got two Democratic Party superstars sharing a Cincinnati stage and drawing attention galore. The fact that they're both women and that one is reportedly eyeing the other to join her on the Democratic ticket turned a morning Hillary Clinton rally into something way more than run-of-the-mill. For the first time since Elizabeth Warren endorsed Clinton earlier this month, the two appeared side by side. The crowd was roaring, the speeches soaring, and the attacks on Donald Trump definitely not boring.
This is my fight song. Take back my life song.
I'm here today because I'm with her. Yes, her. What kind of a man roots for people to lose their jobs, to lose their homes, to lose their life savings? I'll tell you what kind of a man. A small, insecure money grubber who fights for no one but himself. Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States because she knows what it takes to beat a thin-skinned bully who is driven by greed and hate. You know I could do this all day. I really could. Donald Trump calls African Americans thugs, Muslims terrorists, Latinos rapists and criminals, and women bimbos. Hillary Clinton believes that racism, hatred, injustice, and bigotry have no place in our country. She fights for us. She fights for us, and we will fight for Hillary Clinton.
Elizabeth is leading the fight to liberate millions of Americans from the burden of student debt. And no one works harder to make sure Wall Street never wrecks Main Street again. And I must say, I do just love to see how she gets under Donald Trump's thin skin.
That Clinton-Warren duet in Cincinnati drew quite the reaction from Donald J. Trump, billionaire, but it also garnered glowing reviews from reporters on the ground and from ye old cable news punditry class.
I was struck by their embrace. I was struck by how she completed Hillary Clinton's sentences in some respects, but it also seemed to make Hillary Clinton sharper as well about her argument about why she's fighting for the little guy.
Anita, you watched this event. It did seem like magic on that stage.
I think Democrats across the country probably looked at this event and thought they saw a pretty good winning ticket for the fall. The chemistry looked very real.
Hillary Clinton clearly enjoyed campaigning with her today. That was evident as well. So to have her on board the team in a full way, I think is a benefit to Hillary Clinton.
And Hillary needs that boost, she needs that energy. She's also doing her a favor because she's able to take on the Trump defensive in a way that her husband attempted to do, but it wasn't quite as well received. So I think the girls teaming up is a good move.
Did you see the matching pantsuits? There they are.
I love the fact that two women in matching blue pantsuits are having a conversation about a man's hat.
Ladies, can I just start with the obvious there? Those blue suits, the matching blue suits, and then they call Donald Trump goofy.
It's a pantsuit extravaganza.
And they have the same hair and all that kind of stuff.
John, Warren has moved closer and closer inextricably to the center ring of this race. You and I disagree about how likely it is that she's going to be picked to be on the ticket, but does she look to you off of that event like Hillary Clinton's running mate?
I don't even know that we disagree about the likelihood, in the sense that I agree with you, it's not that likely. I look at that picture out there and I say if Hillary Clinton was smart, she would consider Elizabeth Warren very seriously for this job. She needs energy, she needs passion, she needs a jolt of electricity, and she needs to connect with those Sanders voters who are still, in some worrying numbers, staying away from her and have not come over to her. Elizabeth Warren would solve that problem, and it would be an electric thing out there. Now, that may be why she won't pick her, but I think she should.
The dumbest thing you can do, and Hillary Clinton knows this well, is to pick somebody because they're electric or magic or they're good at a rally. You pick someone who can be seen as ready to be president and who you want to govern with. Well, and I think in the end, there's going to be somebody in America who Hillary Clinton thinks is a better commander-in-chief, potentially, and she'd more likely like to spend 4 or 8 years.
Look, in terms of national security credentials, you know, there are others who have more than Elizabeth Warren by far. I think Elizabeth Warren is right that when she says she would pass the ready-to-be commander-in-chief threshold. I also just think that you look at, again, I'm going to use a hackneyed example, but you remember well what happened when Bill Clinton put Al Gore on the ticket against all conventional wisdom back in 1992, and he got that boost. I think a very similar thing could happen with Elizabeth Warren on this ticket.
There's no doubt that today was a special event, and if you're a Republican and you want to deny that, you're nuts. There was a ton of energy and emotion in the room, and you forget every other aspect of every qualification Elizabeth Warren brings to the table for a moment. Two women who can rally a crowd, who can take on Donald Trump with that degree of confidence and aggressiveness, that is a powerful thing. She'll get a big speech at the convention. She'll campaign for Senate candidates throughout the country. She'll raise money in her own way. But I just don't think the Clintons are going to put someone that far to the left, that much of a strong personality on the ticket.
Maybe true.
Just don't think
it's a reasonable horse race approximation. But I'll say the other thing Hillary Clinton was thinking today was, I'm really glad I didn't run against that woman for the Democratic nomination because she would have beat me. All right, and that's probably another reason why she won't end up on the ticket. All right. Anyway, it didn't take long for Donald Trump to unleash an unusually energetic rebuke of Warren's 2016 campaign trail debut. The presumptive Republican nominee sent out a press release calling the appearance with Clinton a, quote, sad attempt at pandering to the Sanders wing, end quote, of the Democratic Party. It also called Warren a, quote, sellout for backing Clinton. And in a phone conversation with NBC's Hallie Jackson, Trump lashed out even further at Elizabeth Warren, whom he likes to call Pocahontas, calling her, quote, a fraud and a, quote, racist because he says she, quote, created a phony heritage. Mark, my question for you is, it's not that common to see a presumptive nominee or nominee attacking a surrogate in this way. What's that about? What's the politics
punching
of that?
down is normally not a good idea, but Donald Trump, when he is genuinely riled, Trump lets himself be Trump, and I think there might be something to that. I also think that he needs to unite the Republican base. Part of why he's struggling right now is he needs Republicans on his side. As much as Hillary Clinton unites the Republican base, Elizabeth Warren does even more. I think that he'd be smarter to talk about her liberal policies than going after her personally.
Well, that's certainly true. And I totally understand the politics of it. He's trying to get all, Trump has an ideologically diverse coalition, which means he also has an ideologically diverse, those who are hanging back are also ideologically diverse. This helps with conservatives, no doubt about it. But I got to say, for a guy who has gotten himself in trouble, not just with us, not just with Democrats and liberals, but with a lot of Republicans for playing with racial or racist fire, this Pocahontas thing is doing him no good. Go after her because she's too left-wing. The Pocahontas thing, it's just not good for him, I think, in the long run. Again, even with the member of his own party.
I also think, again, making it personal about her rather than linking her to liberals. He's in a bit of a box, though, because she is very similar to Bernie Sanders. And he's still trying to court Bernie Sanders supporters, as difficult as you and I both think that will be.
Yeah.
I think he'd be better served not maybe being so personal about it.
I agree with that.
All right, holy polls, Batman. Over the weekend, there was a lot of talk about some new general election surveys. And once again, Hillary Clinton is leading Donald Trump in national polls by a wider margin than she is leading him in many of the battleground states. There's a new NBC News Wall Street Journal survey that shows Clinton beating Trump 5 points, 46-41. Some brand new numbers from that same poll just out this evening. 52% of registered Republicans in the survey said they're not satisfied with Trump as their nominee. 45% of Democrats say the same thing about Clinton. There's another new national poll out over the weekend, ABC News and the Washington Post. There, Clinton has a much larger lead, double digits, 51-39 over Trump. But the share of Democrats in that poll is significantly higher than NBC's share, accounting for a lot of the difference. NBC also, or CBS rather, had a lot of battleground tracker polls. Those tell a different story about the race and obviously matter more in terms of the Electoral College than the national polls. Clinton has a 1-point lead in Colorado, 2-point lead in North Carolina, 3 points in Florida, 5 in Wisconsin, all critically important states. In all those races, the distance between the candidates is within the margin of error. Texas University put out a poll of the Lone Star State. That shows Trump just up 8 points there. One number got a lot of discussion, not about Clinton and Trump, but about President Obama, and it follows a trend line that we've talked a lot about. It's in that ABC News Washington Post poll, and there it shows the president's approval rating at 56%. That is the highest it's been since way back in 2011 after Osama bin Laden was killed. So, John, a lot of data, and again, continuing that pattern of Trump closer in the battleground states. What jumps out at you in all this numbers?
Well, there are the two obvious conundrums to unravel, one of which is why the Washington Post ABC poll is so different nationally from the NBC Wall Street Journal poll. These are both well-respected pollsters. They both obviously have different samples. They've come up with different, what their picture of the electorate is. One of them is much more, thinks the Democrats are in much stronger position than the other. I don't know that I would want to adjudicate on that basis. You know, the Bloomberg Politics poll, national poll, had had Clinton up by 12. You know, these pollsters are figuring out what their sample is, not by putting their thumb on the scale, but by talking to people. So we don't know at this point. The Republican Party's in a lot of trouble as a brand. Could be that ABC Washington Post poll is right nationally. The other conundrum I'll leave you to talk about, because I'm out of wind here, but, you know, is the disparity between the national polls and the state polls. Very important and a little bit still mysterious as to why that would be.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've got a state like California where Trump is not competitive right now, a state like New York, big states where you got a lot of people that are going to be in part of that national poll. The battleground state polls are interesting. You know, Clinton's been on television and Super PAC's been on television in those states.
Trump
people made a big deal about the fact that Trump wasn't, and yet the Trump people will point out to you that suggests that he's not in nearly as much trouble. Generally, in the battleground states, he's doing better with independents and better with men. And those states tend to have independents who may be more blue collar, maybe more like Reagan Democrats, now independents. And you got to be hardened if you're a Republican or you're a Trump supporter or Trump to say the battleground states are closer. It's a big deal.
Yeah, especially given how bad his last month has been. All right, the Supreme Court today announced two major decisions, one overturning an abortion law in Texas, the other overturning the corruption conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. We will talk about the impact of both of those big decisions, really big, after these words from our sponsors. The Supreme Court today struck down parts of a Texas law that restricted the number of abortion clinics in the Lone Star State, ruling that the provisions in question placed an undue burden on women. The 5-3 decision was the court's most sweeping statement on abortion rights in decades and will impact laws in dozens of other states. The Clinton campaign was quick to put out a celebratory statement this morning, calling the decision a, quote, victory for women across America. Donald Trump has so far not responded publicly. So, Mark, I have two questions for you about this. What do you think the fallout is from this decision? It is historic by any stretch. Going back to Casey, there's not been a bigger decision. Fallout, and what do you think the impact will be on the presidential race?
Well, it shows there's a 5-vote majority to support the Casey decision and not having an undue burden on women seeking to get abortions. Obviously, it has a huge impact in Texas on actual access to abortions and in other states. And it reminds anyone who doesn't remember this that while Justice Kennedy is a swing vote on a lot of issues, he's been a pretty reliable vote for abortion rights. And until Republicans figure out a way to replace not just Justice Scalia, if they can do that, but someone else from that 5-vote majority on this issue, abortion rights will continue to be protected and in some cases expanded by the Supreme Court.
Right. It is, the Roe v. Wade and Casey, which is a successor decision almost 20 years later, have been the most intensely litigated, polarizing argument, discussions maybe in our lifetime in politics. And yet, the basic core thing that's embodied in both those decisions, which is safe, legal, and rare, we're not going to get rid of abortion rights. No matter how the Supreme Court has waxed and waned, at this point, you could put another Clarence Thomas on the court, and you'd still have 5 votes to basically go for safe, legal, and rare. And that's, I think, an important affirmation. And it shows us something about just how, in a weird way, as controversial as Roe was, how actually kind of durable it's turned out to be over now 40 years of jurisprudence.
It's going to be interesting to see how Donald Trump handles this because it's a tough decision to fight at this point with making any argument that's not complicated and doesn't risk inflaming the other side as well.
And in our hearts, we don't think that Donald Trump is actually some like wild pro-life person. If you think about his history on the issue, until this campaign, he's never been a pro-lifer. It would highlight an issue on which I think his authenticity is most clearly in question. If you look at the history of where he's been on the issue and what he has said about it over time, I think he might just leave it alone.
Yep, very big ruling. We're going to have more on that with Pete Williams later in the program, as well as on another high court ruling today. The justices ruled unanimously on this one to vacate the conviction of the former governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, a Republican. McDonnell was convicted of corruption back in 2014 after he accepted gifts and vacations from the CEO of a Virginia-based company who was trying to gain access to the governor and members of his team. In the court's decision, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, called what McDonnell did distasteful, but ultimately ruled that federal prosecutors' definition of an official act was too broad. John, I thought this prosecution was outrageous from the beginning. I'm delighted with how the court ruled. I'm wondering what you think the implications are for this ruling for prosecutors, politicians, and the press.
A lot of politicians all over the country breathing a big sigh of relief here because, this was notably a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Far left to far right, everyone thought this was a crappy outcome for McDonnell. It is. I think that the idea that the only kind of corruption in our politics is straightforward quid pro quo bribery is ridiculous because there's a systemic corruption that takes place in our totally messed up system of campaign finance. But in this particular instance, the things that McDonnell did, if you criminalize those across the country, there'd be a vast number of people, legislators and executives, who would end up in jail, and I think that would be wrong.
Reporters always side implicitly and sometimes explicitly with the prosecution until the person's either found not guilty at trial, or in this case, I bet now a lot of people say, well, of course he shouldn't have been convicted. I think politicians should not overread the lesson here. They shouldn't assume, well, now you can take all the gifts you want. And most importantly for prosecutors, this was not a case that should ever have been brought. There are plenty of public corruption cases that are absolutely legit. There's some people now who've been convicted who think this is going to get their sentences overturned, their convictions overturned. It should not. Bob McDonnell did not do anything official.
I totally agree.
For this guy.
And as the court said, distasteful. You know what? There's a really good remedy to a lot of distasteful actions on the part. We should write about them. The press should have covered this. It should have been a big story. And if the voters didn't like it, they could vote him out.
The problem with that is you don't know the facts without subpoena power. But this prosecutor, fine to investigate it, they shouldn't have indicted him. All right, up next. Donald J. Trump, billionaire, walks back his immigration stance. We'll talk about Trump's interview with Bloomberg Politics over the weekend when we come back.
The world is still pretty much comprehensively freaking out over the United Kingdom's vote to leave the European Union at the end of last week. Today, Secretary of State John Kerry met with EU officials in Brussels amid continued disagreement between UK leaders and EU leaders about how exactly to begin the negotiations of Britain's withdrawal. Opponents of the move are still trying to find any way they can to stop it, as many Brits express seller's remorse. An online petition calling for a second referendum has now been signed by more than 3.5 million people, and some Scottish officials are exploring ways to remain a part of the EU or force another vote or both. Mark, my question for you is, a year from now, I ask you, will Britain still be part of the EU, or will it actually be gonzo?
I have no bloody idea. I find the online petition to be kind of a joke. I don't care about that. I really don't understand the Scots standing to do this. What I think matters is what the next prime minister does. Right. And you see already, markets are calming. People who predicted that this would somehow lead to like widespread sustained turmoil, I never thought so. I don't see that.
A lot of money's been lost.
Yeah.
A lot of people's money's been lost.
They're all going to make it back in like the next week. There are bargains out there.
You're never going to be my. You're not going to be my stock picker. That's the thing.
But to me, the biggest sign of where this is headed is the fact that within the European Union there's disagreement about how quickly we want this to happen. The initial reaction was we got to get this right away. Now there's real division within countries and within the EU about maybe there's some way to patch this up.
Well, you've now got people like Boris Johnson, who are the leaders of the Leave campaign, saying, "Well, what I meant by leave was we still want to be part of it. We want to be part of the common market, and we still want to have kind of immigration and relatively open borders. We just don't want to be part of the regulatory regime and some of the tax regimes." You know, the question is going to be, I think that increasingly it looks like whoever is going to be the new leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister is going to have to hold a snap election at the end of the year to get another vote on this. Who becomes the Labour leader if Jeremy Corbyn goes away? Does Labour win that election? If Labour were to win an election against the Tory party before the end of this year, Labour will have another referendum on this. And you could very easily, under those circumstances, there's a lot of contingencies there, but under those circumstances, you could have another referendum and you could end up just having this whole thing go away and we go back to the status quo ante 6 months from now.
Yeah, I don't think that's the most likely outcome, but
it's not the most likely.
But it's a reasonable outcome, because the reality is, after the vote, and again, this is where the petition does play into it, the press is completely against exit.
Right.
And so right now,
most of Parliament.
There's not very many voices arguing in a strenuous way. As you point out, even Boris Johnson now is basically saying,
maybe we still kind of maybe want to be in that thing.
Slowly head to the exit, partial exit. All right. Now it's time to talk about another big exit, not Britain, but rather Republicans who are leaving the party because of Donald Trump. In the past 2 weeks, the following Republicans have endorsed Hillary Clinton, not all of them leaving the Republican Party, but leaving their party's nominee. That includes Bush 43's Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, as well as Bush 43's Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, Bush 41's National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and the former Reagan administration official, Jim Cecconi, among a few others. George Will, the conservative columnist over the weekend, suggested he was leaving the Republican Party and not voting for Donald Trump. So there are a lot of, handful, I should say, of elite defections. There are a lot more private ones. But when and if would you say that these kind of elite Republican defections away from Trump and in some cases away from the Republican Party will actually hurt his chances of winning?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. I find it hard to think that any of those people who we just mentioned, all of whom are familiar names to you and me, but no voter in America, virtually no voter knows who they are, including Hank Paulson, is going to matter to any of them. The thing that's relevant to me about it is that it's reflective of a thing that is actually going on in the rest of the Republican Party, which is that Trump is having, right now, he's getting about 75% of Republicans to be for him. When you look at these polls, national polls, battleground state polls, the Republican Party has not yet come home to Trump. And there's a lot of polling that suggests there are still a lot of dissatisfaction with Trump. These people are high-profile representatives of that, and to the extent that they represent that, that's meaningful.
Trump's chance of winning this general election have always been and are still based on the notion of a different kind of coalition, and one that says people who made Treasury Department decisions in the last 10 years, people who made national security decisions in the last 10 years, 20 years, they're wrong. If you like the way things are, vote with these guys. Right. And I think that, would Trump want their endorsements? He often will say, I don't even want their endorsements. I don't know that he wants these guys' endorsements. These are people who are establishmentarians who care about the status quo.
But there are, as you know, there are establishmentarian voters who are basically the voter version of these people. And if Trump is...
And can Trump replace them with
He's got to replace them
blue-collar people.
Somehow he's got to get, but he's got to get over 75% of people who are self-identified Republicans.
Yes, that number...
You can't win the presidency with 75%.
That number has to grow, obviously. But the campaign, I think, is rightfully relatively confident. If they have a good running mate, if they have a good convention, if he has a good debate, he can bring the party back.
Can he have a good convention if a lot of the most famous Republicans in the country don't show up?
Might even help him.
Okay, all right. Coming up, more from Donald Trump's Scottish expedition with a reporter who was with him. When we come right back.
President Obama has mass deported vast numbers of people. And it's never reported, the most ever, and it's never reported. I think people are going to find that I have not only the best policies, but I will have the biggest heart of anybody.
So you wouldn't call it mass deportation?
I'm not going to say it. No, I would not call it mass. I would not call it mass deportation.
That was Donald J. Trump, billionaire, in Scotland this weekend. Walking back a bit, his position on immigration during an interview with our colleague, Bloomberg Politics reporter Kevin Sorelli, who joins us now right here in studio. Also joining us, MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt, who's covering the other major party candidate, Hillary Clinton, in Chicago today. Kevin, Casey, Kays, thank you both for joining us. Casey, to start with you, we want to talk about this decision on abortion from the Supreme Court. How has Hillary Clinton responded to that herself and by her campaign?
Well, look, this is a decision where she, of course, tweeted about it immediately, saying that it was the right decision for women. But it's not necessarily something, we didn't hear a lot about it from Hillary Clinton today on the stump. I think had this been a different decision than the one that actually did come down, you may have heard something of a noisier reaction. But I think this was warmly embraced, but not necessarily overly focused on by the Clinton campaign today.
Kevin, you've got a little bit of a scoop on this and how the Trump campaign, John, I'm talking about the fact that Trump hadn't tweeted or put out a statement. How is the Trump campaign dealing with this?
Well, he has not put out a statement, clearly underscoring just how contentious this issue has become. But I was just speaking with members of Trump's evangelical board, and they told me that the campaign has been in touch with them, and they view this as another reason why Donald Trump should be president, to appoint conservative Supreme Court judges. So they're using this to pivot, of course, to the Supreme Court.
So, Kevin, you were in Scotland with Donald Trump, and you talked to him about what seems like a pivot on his immigration stance. Just give us a sense of the flavor of that conversation, and also tell us whether you had any haggis while you were there.
I did not have haggis, I can tell you. It sounded a little bit gross to me. Okay. But here's what I can tell you is that after we went through a truly remarkable, historic day, 2 days in Scotland with Donald Trump, where he spoke and was criticized for speaking at 2 of his golf course properties, he went on a rolling press gaggle, if you will, taking us from hole to hole and commenting. And after that concluded, we then went to his clubhouse where I interviewed him, more broadly speaking about this shift in tone that we're starting to see ever since he's removed Corey Lewandowski from campaign manager. We talked about two of the most controversial policy positions that he's put out, of course being immigration and the proposed temporary Muslim ban. And in the conversation with me, what we noticed was someone who was clearly trying to pivot to a general election. He said that he wanted to ban and limit immigration from countries where there are several terrorists with regards to the Muslim ban. And on immigration, of course, he says that there will not be, quote unquote, mass deportations.
Casey, I want to ask you one of the same questions I asked Kevin, which is whether you've had any haggis while you were there in Chicago. They have very exceptionally good haggis there. If you haven't yet, make sure you find some.
I was unaware.
Okay.
I'll have to go looking for some.
Go look.
I thought they had pizza here,
Yeah,
right?
they have both, deep dish haggis. My question for you relates to what we saw earlier in the show, which is the incredible the sight of Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton out there on stage together, first time at a public event. We talked about what it seemed like from afar. There was a lot of electricity. Give us a sense of what it was like in the room.
Well, I should say I was not in the room in Cincinnati. I've been here in Chicago covering her speech here. But one thing I will add to the segment you guys did earlier is that her campaign is going out of its way to make sure that this is viewed as an intense collaboration. They're telling reporters about how Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren rode to the event together after they were at their hotel in the morning, looking over remarks together. These are the kind of details that, as you both know well, the Clinton campaign doesn't toss around. It's very hard to say to them, hey, got any interesting color that would help inform us? A lot of times they basically laugh and say, sorry, no, we don't. In this particular case, they're trying to underscore that. And I think, the visuals on the stage, the two of them even, they almost looked like if they were dressed alike. Elizabeth Warren was standing in the frame applauding throughout Hillary Clinton's remarks. They are definitely treating her in an embracing way. And I think that's noteworthy regardless of where she stands in this kind of sweepstakes back and forth, just because I think they know that it's important that they keep her in the fold, and I think it helps illustrate that, she can play a significant role even if it's not on the ticket.
Casey, how would you summarize the Clinton campaign's view of Trump's trip to Scotland?
I think that they put out the ad that they put out says most of what you need to know about their view of it. I think they feel like, if we're going to take the serious tact on this, they feel like he highlighted all of the weaknesses he has compared to her strengths on this. And they, of course, have talked about having her do a foreign trip because it would underscore the strengths she has. And I think that they viewed what came out of Scotland as exactly what they needed to help push their message forward. So no complaints on the trip to Turnberry from Team Clinton.
So, Kevin, before he went, people were kind of scratching their heads and saying, why is he spending a couple days at his private golf courses? Having gone and watched what he did, and obviously he weighed in on many issues of the day, do you understand the logic of it any better now, having come back?
Well, I mean, this was planned before Brexit. This was planned completely separate from Brexit, but it was a pretty surreal moment as we in the press corps were all awaiting for him to land in his helicopter, and we're getting word on Twitter that Cameron had just resigned. And so I think just from the historical context and the parallels, of course, between Trump supporters as well as what we're seeing in the UK. But I will note that tomorrow, when Trump is going to give a trade speech in suburban Pittsburgh, and of course he'll be able to tap into West Virginia and Ohio media markets, I would expect him to really take on the difference in policy between Senator Warren and Hillary Clinton. And I think that he is going to look, and the people that I spoke with today alluded to him being able to really point a clear difference in terms of trade policy on the Trans-Pacific Partnership between Hillary Clinton and Senator Warren.
Kevin, I recognize that the Brexit vote was a coincidence in the sense that Trump did not anticipate necessarily that there would be an exit. But that date was on the calendar as the date when a historic vote was going to take place, right? I still find it amazing that his first words out of his mouth were not, when he got on that golf course on Friday, was not to talk about this thing that had just happened. And that he should have been prepared for that regardless. Did you have any sense of, prepared for the fact that he would have to comment on the outcome, whatever it was? Do you have any sense of why it was that he did not go out and do the statesman thing as any other normal candidate would have done?
What's interesting is that there were no larger leaders who were representing Scotland that were there. There were some local politicians there, and that should be noted. And in terms of before the press conference began, when he walked into the golf course, he did do an immediate gaggle that was first before the press conference, where he did comment on Brexit. And again, immediately, we heard from him. He put out a statement before the White House did, remarkably. And we did hear that he immediately did try to draw those parallels between the UK declaring independence and his own supporters.
Casey, how is Trump going to, I mean, the Clinton campaign going to deal with trade? If Trump tries to get to her left, to the protectionist side, what do you think she'll do?
Well, I think that this is really tricky, and one thing that's flown a little under the radar today is Bernie Sanders coming out and calling for the Democratic Party to reject the TPP as part of the platform, which it was interesting to me because I think it signals that if you have to say something like that publicly, you're obviously trying to stir up something of a fight. They have these private negotiations going on that don't seem to be going. Apparently, this would be a sign that they're not going as well as some might hope on the Clinton side. And so I do think that it's a very thorny issue that she really hasn't totally sorted out yet because, you know, especially in that context, it would put her at odds with the President of the United States, who's still at this point the leader of the Democratic Party. So I think that that is one place where there's an opportunity for the Trump campaign. I mean, we've seen her wrestle with this throughout the primary. She was, in the view of many Bernie Sanders supporters, slow to come around on this issue, and there's no real indication to me that she still feels entirely comfortable. It's one of those dancing on the head of the pin things that a lot of her aides talked about in the wake of that. So I think there's an opportunity there for Trump.
I do, too. I agree with you. I think this is going to be one of the most complicated things she has to deal with if Trump tries to outflank her, because she's been moving around and hard to know where she actually wants to end up. Casey Hunt in Chicago. Kevin here. Thank you very much. Welcome home.
Bernie Sanders not helping much.
No, not on that.
Helping right now. No.
Not on that. When we come back, we're joined by the man, our friend, Al Hunt, right after this.
Our next guest is the great Albert Hunt, whose latest Bloomberg View column compares the economic agendas of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Al is in our D.C. bureau. Thanks for coming on, Al. We'll talk to you about your column in a second, but I want to ask you about the subject that I'm obsessed with right now, which is Brexit. If just from totally from the United States perspective, just Secretary of State Kerry had some comments about this today. But from the U.S. perspective, where you sit in Washington, D.C., what is it that is most disconcerting and the biggest challenge that American policymakers are grappling with right now as a result of Brexit, assuming that it actually happens?
Well, John, you know, the American economy is actually doing better than most other Western economies, but we're very dependent on how they do. I mean, if China sneezes, we get a cold, and Europe, for all of its problems, is not unimportant. And the fear is that this will cause some kind of a downturn, not just in Great Britain, but also on the continent, and that affects the U.S. There's nothing we can do about it, but that's the fear.
So, Al, you think it's mostly that the economics are more disconcerting to American policymakers than the potential security implications dealing with all the various things that America has to deal with in terms of how Europe confronts Middle Eastern challenges, terrorist challenges, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, John, that's a very good point, and also Putin. I mean, Putin is a real worry and a real concern, and I think the challenges are really equal. And the feeling is, how strong can Europe be? You know, Great Britain has been a great ally in most of these confrontations that we have had. They've backed away a bit in the Middle East, but they really have been. And if it's a weaker Britain, I think that's a problem for us, and particularly in the security area.
Al, I want to switch to your column where you look at the macroeconomic policies of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and their proposals. Just talk about the vagueness of Trump's proposals and where the big holes are.
Well, they both have big problems, Mark, and let me just go to Clinton for a minute. One of her big problems is that she has this obsession of saying, I'm really paying for everything. She really isn't, but she tries to argue that. And let me give you one example. Infrastructure. She's got a $275 billion infrastructure plan. Nobody who's thought about what we need for bridges and highways and airports thinks that's anywhere near adequate. She'll have to double that, but she won't raise the gas tax or propose that or deal with a carbon tax. So how she's going to squeeze that together really will be difficult in the months ahead. But Trump's problems are much, as he would say, huger. It's not just that to get unemployment down, to really add jobs, he relies on trade sanctions, protectionism, which no one believes. Let's just take his tax plan. Right now, it's going to cost about $10 trillion over the next 10 years. I talked to Steve Moore, one of two supply-siders he has charged with reforming it to make it a bit more palatable. Steve says we'll get it down to $3 trillion. It'll be supply-side, and it'll be middle-class oriented. You know something, Mark? You can't do that. It all doesn't fit. And I think it's incumbent upon us, just as my pal John Heilemann says, we ought to stay on him on the refusal to release taxes. We ought to stay on him on this tax stuff.
So Moore's brief is to take a plan from $10 trillion over 10 years to $3 trillion?
That's what he says they want to do, to cut it by 2/3. A, if he tries to do that, I have a feeling that his principal is going to run away from it. But B, you just can't do it. You can't make it a supply-side tax cut, which certainly doesn't go and penalize the wealthy, if you will, and really have a big middle-class tax cut without raising any taxes elsewhere. It's just not. It's not feasible.
Al, let me ask you about the politics of each of their economic proposals within their parties. So, you know, Clinton has always been seen as a kind of centrist Democrat, new Democrat in that mold, and now she's the presumptive leader of a party that is much more, in terms of its policy preferences, much closer to Bernie Sanders. Does she have political problems with her proposals on the left of her own party?
I think that Donald Trump assuages a lot of those fears, John. I think otherwise she might. She's already thrown him some red meat on the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact, which she opposes, or says she opposed. I don't really think that she does. She'll go halfway on higher education. She won't go as far as Bernie went. She'll give him something on rhetoric on Wall Street. But I think one of her biggest challenges, as I said a moment ago, is going to be infrastructure, because that's something that all Democrats should agree on. But that $275 billion, I hate to say this, that really is small stuff. That's paltry. That's not going to get you very many highways or bridges or airports.
Al, in the context of the Veep stakes choices, the various Trump campaign folks have said they're going to pick somebody, he's going to pick somebody who's clearly seen as qualified to be president. Clearly passed that test. Of the people who are said to be under consideration, who do you think fits that bill?
Bob Corker.
Yeah.
I don't think he'll pick him, but I think Bob Corker probably best fits the bill. And on the Democratic side, Tim Kaine.
Do you think that Chris Christie would meet that bar for most people?
Not as much as Corker. He has no foreign policy experience. He's an immensely unpopular governor of New Jersey. There's still a little bit of a whiff of scandal hanging over him. So I think it would be a harder sell. It wouldn't be as hard as a few other people.
What about Newt Gingrich, Al? Last question. Yes or no?
Oh, it's my wish. It's my dream. I've got a Gingrich file this big. I mean, imagine the Family Values Party, 6 marriages, all the stuff that Newt said over the years. I mean, we could turn this into a 5-hour show every day, John.
All right, we will, just on your behalf, Al, we will be praying for Newt Gingrich to be Donald Trump's
with you.
Thanks, Al.
Al Hunt, you're awesome as always. Coming up, we talk SCOTUS with NBC News Justice correspondent, the great Pete Williams, right after this.
Joining us now from outside the Supreme Court in Washington to talk more about the Supreme Court rulings today, NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, thanks for joining us. I want to start with the abortion case out of Texas. I erroneously suggested before that Justice Kennedy had never voted, or that he was a reliably pro-choice vote on the court. He's not on partial birth abortion. He voted on the pro-life side. Where does Justice Kennedy stand now in terms of abortion and the role of the court?
Well, partial birth abortion, remember, the court struck down a Nebraska law that stopped these so-called partial birth abortions. Then came the federal law, and that's when Justice Kennedy wrote the decision, which alarmed advocates of abortion rights. But I think that was a bridge too far for him. This really gets back to the main holding of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the big case 25 years ago, that today the Supreme Court picks up the language on it. What they say is that these 2 restrictions in Texas, saying that doctors have to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals and the clinics have to be built to the same standards as surgical centers in terms of equipment, staffing, construction standards, and so forth, they add to the obstacles that make it harder to get an abortion, but they don't add any medical benefits. And for that reason, he said it's an undue burden, echoing the language of Casey. So it's surprising, though. During the oral argument, Kennedy seemed not to be willing to go that far, and he seemed to be concerned about the facts in the case. And he suggested even at one point sending it back for more development about, well, okay, which law caused which clinics to close, so we know how these two laws work differently. But clearly he joined the 4 more liberal justices, and that gave us this 5-3 ruling that would have had the same outcome even if Antonin Scalia had still been on the court. It would have just been 5-4.
Pete, talk about the implications of this for other states around the country. There are obviously a bunch of states that have similar provisions as the Texas law in various regards. Some have actually been modeled on the Texas law. What happens now in all those states?
Immediately nothing. This ruling today applies only to Texas, but what will happen is the opponents of those laws will take the ruling, they'll go back into court, and they'll say, look, the same logic applies here in our state as applied to Texas. We want these laws struck down, and I would expect for the most part they'll win. So those laws are going to be in big trouble. And this wedge of laws, this dozen or so laws like Texas, was a new strategy for opponents of abortion. After years of going after the patients by restricting women's access by saying you got to have counseling or there's a waiting period or reducing the period of time during pregnancy when abortion is legal, they said, well, that's not working. Let's go after the clinics and the doctors, and today they lost.
Pete, how do you explain unanimous ruling from the justices on the Bob McDonnell case, different from the prosecutor making a decision? A federal prosecutor sees this as not only a good prosecution to bring, but earns a conviction. How can you reconcile that with the unanimous view of the court?
All you had to do is hear the oral argument. There wasn't a single justice that was a big cheerleader for the prosecution of Bob McDonnell. Now, today, the Chief Justice who wrote this unanimous opinion said that it's pretty tawdry what the former governor did. But the essence of the case is, what's an official act? The federal law says you violate the law if you take something like he got here, cash and gifts, in exchange for performing official acts. So that was the question, what's an official act? And the court said today, the kind of stuff that Governor McDonnell did, setting up meetings, talking to staffers, hosting lunches, that's garden variety stuff that government officials do all the time. That's not an official act. An official act, they said, is when you have a decision pending and you vote on it or you influence that decision. So as a technical matter, the case is sent back. The appeals court can look at it again and see if there's a point in a retrial. But basically, they send the prosecution back severely handicapped. And not only this case, but it's going to make it harder for prosecutors to bring corruption cases against other public officials. You know, those 2 legislators up in New York State, their cases are on hold, waiting for the Supreme Court decision for their sentence. The lawyer for Robert Menendez, who faces a corruption charge from the federal government, that he did favors for an eye doctor from Florida in return for travel and so forth, that case could be affected by this. So it's going to every time the Supreme Court rules to toughen the corruption laws, it takes a while for it to work through the courts before you really know how big an effect it had.
Great. Pete Williams at the court. Thanks very much, Pete. Appreciate it. And we'll be right back.
On BloombergPolitics.com, you really ought to check out Michael C. Bender's story about 13 executive orders that Trump could accomplish without congressional approval if he becomes the President of the United States. After checking that out, or even before that, you might want to watch Bloomberg West, where Emily Chang is speaking to the U.S. CTO, Megan Smith. She's great. Until tomorrow, from Mark and me, we have one word for you, and that is sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. The Supreme Court today struck down restrictions on abortion in Texas. By a 5-3 vote, justices rejected the state's position that its 2013 law was needed